Welcome to Intersections, where faith, ideas, and life meet. Today we'll be talking about video games, the playground of good and evil. I remember a couple of years ago waiting on a sandwich being made at a sandwich shop and was completely delighted that Pac-Man was in the corner. Now, I had not played much Pac-Man, but I knew it was an old game and easy to understand. So I put my 25 cents in and began playing Pac-Man. One game wasn't enough because it said I had a certain amount of points and I knew I could do better than that. And so as I waited on the sandwich, I put another 25 cents in and played another game of Pac-Man. Then the sandwich arrived and I played a third game, feeling that the sandwich could wait while I finished Pac-Man. That's maybe a negative view of video games, but I'd like to present another story, and that is I have a nephew who's trying to learn science. And when I looked at the various ways to teach him science, I found a game that could actually help him learn, a video game. So when we're talking about the playground of good and evil, are the lines as clearly delineated as they were in Genesis 3, where there was a tree in the garden, and it was the tree that had to do with evil. Are video games that clearly delineated? That's a topic that we're addressing today. Video games, the playground of good and evil.
Thank you, Carla, for taking us on a trip down the memory lane. I too played Pac-Man when I was growing up, and a few other games that I don't remember all the names of. One thing that, as we were talking a few moments earlier, Galaga, something that's shooting some planes, and it was very simple, but things have gotten very complicated these days. But first of all, if you played video games at all growing up, what were some of your favorite games? Looking at you first.
Because I'm the youngest. Yeah. I'd have to say, the definitive is probably Super Mario Brothers. For any child who grew up in my generation, with the Nintendo character, or maybe Sonic the Hedgehog, the Sega character. Those are some of the classic video games, I think. And Mario's still around today. He still makes it around. So.
Simply put, what were the objectives of these games?
I mean, back in the, I think when video games were first starting out, when we had home gaming consoles where you can actually bring the video game home and not have to play it in the arcade, it was very simple, two-dimensional, and a lot of it involved just kind of going through different levels or stages where a character had to perform a certain number of objectives while going through a different stage or land. Get points, trying to get from point A to point B, essentially. I mean, it was that simple. Yeah. And obviously, things have evolved a lot since then.
Evolve or devolve, that's, I guess, the big question.
Yes.
Marlon, were you a gamer ever?
Well, I had to admit this, yes, I was. And back in the Stone Age, we were playing with the first generation of games, and my best friend, Gary Boffman, and I would spend countless hours in the evening playing Asteroids, and I think that was a one-dimensional game. It was just a flat plane, and the object was to survive, which pretty much is the way the games have developed. It's a matter of survival. We were surviving against the elements. Today, I'm not so sure.
So what are we not sure about? We talked, our title today is Playground of Good and Evil. You talk about delineating, finding principles, what's the right application, is it all evil? So what are some of the big questions that are kind of looming over us?
Well, I think the big question is video games are everywhere. Whether it be on the computer or on an actual gaming console. I don't know that there's, most children know what video games are, and maybe they play them regularly, or their friends do, or whatever the case may be. And so it's something that's so prominent, and I think that a lot of times, for whatever reason, children acquire video games, whether it's their parents giving it to them or they buy it themselves, and we don't really think about, kind of what issues are at stake. Is everybody's doing it? So should my kids play video games? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah. And then there's the question of content, and related to what you're saying, there's different ratings that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and different levels of intensity, levels of violence, things that are graphic, whether it's sexually or in terms of the theme.
Sure.
And so the question arises, clearly we want kids to, and people to, whoever's playing to enjoy themselves, but at what point does it become gratuitous?
Well, and it's also an issue of attention. I was traveling just yesterday down from Napa Valley back home, stopping at a rest area and standing in the long line that often occurs at the restrooms. And there was a young girl in front of me. She wouldn't have been more than about 9. And she was just doing this. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I've talked many times. I've got many stories of talking to children or adults waiting for something. And I said, hello, and she just kept at it. And all the time we waited in that line, the whole while she was doing this. And I thought it wasn't about content. It wasn't about, you know, whether it was bad or good. It was all about attention. I couldn't, her attention was completely and totally there, not anywhere else. And that seemed odd. It seemed odd. It seemed sad, but I couldn't figure out what I was sad about. What was I sad about?
The disconnection from reality, from living your life. I mean, your life is now in a little box that you hold in your hand, and you shut the whole world out. Mm-hmm. It's akin to someone who's addicted to television watching. That's all they do, is they just watch television.
Yeah, well, and you know, and it's a good point for review, because there's all these different technologies that are out there now, whether it be your cell phone or, you know, or the television or whatever it is, that can consume your time, you know, consume all of your energy, your attention, and everything. And so I think it is clearly a, you know, a question of are video games harmful or are they beneficial? You know, and I think that you could argue both sides of the point.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the example that Carla gave at the beginning of the program, talking about using it as a tool to teach her nephew science.
Sure.
And so obviously it is a great benefit for those kids. I mean, you could take anything. You can take this Bible, for example, and you could use it as a club to drive people away from Jesus, or you can use it as a revelation, a revealing of his true nature and his love. So it's really the application, and I think, Jeremy, you mentioned that earlier.
Mm-hmm. I learned typing by playing a video game.
Oh, did you?
On the screen there would be words passing by, and I was supposed to type those words before they passed by, so it kind of helped me with accuracy and also speed. And of course, you were trying to improve on both when you're trying to learn typing. So now they don't even call it typing anymore, like keyboarding.
Yeah.
But that's essentially how I learned typing.
So in this program, are you interested in the positive aspects of the video game, or do we want to look at maybe the negative impact that it has on the Christian life?
Everything's game. You know, we
Game.
do a game. everything's open for. Well, and I'd say push a little further. And this is going to make me sound old, I guess. Is what in doing that, what's being left behind? You know, when I was growing up, we spent a lot of our time weeding the garden and planting tomatoes and vegetables and I wouldn't be so opposed to video games if those same children were spending 2 and 3 hours outside digging in the dirt and then went in and did a little bit of video game. But if all they're doing is video games and then they're not experiencing that part, it seems like it gets out of balance.
Yeah, the difficulty, I'm a parent of two children, they're 13 and 14, so they're very much interested in and probably spending more time than they need to, and clearly more than I would like, on video games, or at least thinking about or complaining about video games, not being able to play and so forth. And the confusing thing for me as a parent at times is our culture is, here in the United States at least, seems to be moving from print culture to digital culture. And doing church, I mean, if we have LLBN here, you know, we're using a new medium to share the love of God to people who perhaps would not be so interested in reading, but they're open to watching. And so we're taking advantage of that. And so there's this movement from reading to watching or interacting with a screen, a digital screen. And our children, my children, are clearly in that, immersed in that culture, and they find that to be more interesting and even more beneficial. They would rather read a book on the computer screen than actually read it in front of them. So the confusing thing is, you know, is that all okay? Is moving from print to digital all okay? I mean, the girl that you mentioned earlier, if she was reading, let's say, a book, would that have bothered you just as much? I don't know. But I was born into a print culture, and I'm very much thinking that a book is always better than a Nintendo DS or whatever. But I'm sometimes confused as a parent.
I would say, just an answer to that, it would have bothered me. One's ability to leave that behind and go do something else. Like, we weren't allowed to read even cereal boxes at the table when we were meeting together as a family. So perhaps I would have felt as bad if it were a book being used in that way. I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, I think this raises a good point in that in the 21st century, video games have evolved to the point where they are not so monocentric as we typically think of them as. It's not you playing with a box. Now, because of the internet, almost any gaming console in the world is connected to the World Wide Web, where you are connected to other people. And so you've got these video games where they're essentially almost in some ways kind of like social networking sites, where you can become friends with other people. You can have conversations. You can, there's an extra level of connectivity that's there. I think a lot of people would say is one of the benefits of it.
But even so, your interaction is only during the game. You don't meet to go and have a hot drink.
Oh, well, people do though. I have friends.
You think
who
so?
Are, yeah. Oh, sure, certainly. People who are. That's kind of their.
Fly in from London and.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's kind of their way of. They don't connect playing on an intramural basketball team. They wouldn't connect in that way, but they would connect via this video game community. And so then maybe they'd go and they'd hang out afterwards.
Yeah.
Something.
My
like
children, they. I think just one game they play with their friends from school online, so that's an extra way of being connected with their friends. And one thing that's, if we're talking positive things, although there are clearly many negative things, one positive thing for me has been there's just one game that I can semi-compete with my children, and that's the Super Mario baseball game. It's a very simple baseball game, and sometimes I win, and that makes me feel good. But usually it's my second son with whom I play more, and I guess the positive side is that allows me to bond, and there's something that we can do together. Clearly, if we were gardening together, my more traditional mindset would be more happy with, but it's nearly impossible for me to, So
impossible for you to get them out gardening?
Do gardening, because I don't like gardening either. But
okay.
That's a different story. But yeah, there's that kind of involvement aspect that has been a positive dimension. But going back to the online community thing, of course the flip side is you don't know who you're going to meet and what sort of influence that you're going to have unless the parent is just as involved in the gaming. It's impossible to know all that's going on, and so.
But that's wonderful that you're connecting with your son over it. I mean, certainly that's a positive.
Oh, partly because I enjoy it.
But would you enjoy it so much? You talked about a Mario baseball game. What if it was something where the content was a little more sketchy? Because I think that's a question that a lot of people have. Is it's not just the video games themselves, but it's the content. It may not just be the book itself or whatever the source of material may be, but really the content. We have a slide here that we'd like to bring up that kind of shows a little bit about what we're talking about. If we could bring that up. The Entertainment Software Review Board rates all video games, just like we rate movies, and it puts a label on any video game that you can buy today.
Maybe you could explain for our viewers.
Well, these labels go from, if you're looking at top to bottom, left to right, you've got the first one, which is a letter C, and that's basically appropriate for all ages. That's called early childhood, and they'll say that it's suitable for ages 3 and older. And then moving along, you've got everyone, said to have content that suitable for ages 6 and older. Then you've got everyone 10 plus, said to have content appropriate for children ages 10 and up. And then you've got titles rated teen, which this review board deems as content suitable for ages 13 and older, and then on to mature and up, where it really is deemed to be content only suitable for adults. Now, if you're a parent walking in to buy a video game, what do these things mean? Basically, this is kind of a little stamp to tell you this is the kind of content that you can expect in these video games.
What's interesting to me, Jeremy, is that teen, which is the T, is, just to read on here, it says, it may contain violence, suggestive themes, crude humor, minimal blood, simulating gambling, and or infrequent use of strong language. So just because it says it's suitable for teens, not every parent would agree with that.
Oh, certainly
rating.
not. Certainly not. Yeah, and I think that's where it does take kind of a parent being that parent advocate to step in and to actually look at the video games and to say, well, what kind of content is appropriate for my child and what isn't.
And also ask the question what some of the biblical principles might be in helping determine. What might those be? Some of the principles that we can gather from Scripture.
Well, we talked earlier that we were going to start to disagree at this point. No.
With the Bible? Go ahead.
No, I think in reference to Scripture, we think a lot of that, whatsoever is good, pure, lovely, think on these things. But I'd like to point to a different kind of use of Scripture, and that is their commitment to I don't know how to say it, to the land, to simplicity, to working, a good work ethic. And I think I'm as concerned about what we're leaving behind as the time children are spending on video games. And I go back to the planting of tomatoes. When children are so used to having all the hormonal stimulation of computer games, they're simply not going to be as happy hiking down the trail, it seems to me. So I guess I'm concerned that when they get used to all this stuff, they're not as happy with the simple, not just hiking, but biking.
So you're coming from a more of a wholeness perspective.
A wholeness perspective. I remember as a kid carrying on my belt a book on how to identify trees and how to identify flowers. I don't see kids doing that so much anymore. They're not as concerned. I know you're looking at me like a nerd.
No. But, I agree with you.
But they're not as concerned about nature and being connected to nature. And I think Scripture is filled with that idea of wholeness and simplicity. And that is very frightening to me about leaving behind.
Well, I think you can learn those things online.
Well, it's true. It's true. It's absolutely true.
But you do raise a good point. And as I look at this list of CE, E plus 10, T and M, and I read the descriptions of it, it seems to me that this is almost a conspiracy of desensitization for all the things that are listed in the mature audience, which leads up to intense violence, blood and gore, sexual content, and strong language. If you go back to the C, early childhood, it says contains no material that parents would find inappropriate. Who sets the standard for the parents? I mean, is there as a parent, you have 2 young children, is that going to be the same level as, say, a person in the secular world?
That's a great question. And I think that's where judicious use of this particular standard, I think it is helpful because one can, as a parenting point, if I may say so, I tell my children, clearly M is not, mature is not going to, we're not going to buy them anything. Among the teens, I'll have to know exactly what's in it. They're both teenagers now. And there are a good number of T-rated games that I just don't buy. I know that sometimes they go to their friends' places and they do play, and that's another question. What you allow at home may not always be the same thing.
Well, and your memory isn't always. I remember saying to my nephews, "Okay, now we're going to watch some really good cartoons," thinking Roadrunner, Bugs Bunny, and I remember Roadrunner coming on and thinking, "My word, it's more violent than I remember."
So some cartoons, that's right.
Yeah.
And so helping also children, rather than simply saying this is what you can and cannot do, but helping them also to develop their own decision-making skills in ways that may sometimes be different from yours, but still leading them to be thoughtful in their decisions.
So what is
also
the
difficult.
principle? Julius or Jeremy, what principle do you use, Jeremy, when you're making decisions?
Well, I think it depends. If it's for me or if it's for you know, for a younger audience, I think it would be a little bit different probably. For me personally, I'm not a huge video game player, but I see video games as more or less, you know, purely kind of a source of entertainment. So for me, I like sports games a lot. You know, for me, it's just fun. Get together with a group of friends. You know, you kind of play sort of pseudo-competitively. You know, playing like a basketball game or something like that. For me, I guess where I draw the line is this something, whatever is being acted out, sort of in the video game, where I'm kind of vicariously living out the characters' lives, so to speak, in the video games. Is that something that I would really want translated into my own life? That's kind of where I...
You mean the life that you're living? Is
the
it
life
a Christian
that I'm living,
life?
as in reality, as in
Yeah.
real life. Yes, a Christian life. You know, and if the answer is clearly and unequivocally no, you know, those aren't things that I would want to be participating in or be associated with. Well, then why am I stimulating myself with these things as a source of entertainment? You know.
And where do you draw the line? Where does fantasy become reality? We see these examples over and over again about these guys, you know, Klebold and his friend taking over the high school and slaughtering the students. I mean, we had one recently where one of the victims, I understand, was able to survive only because she played dead. And this person was so used to the video game, and he was living out that video game in this intense attack that when you shot somebody, they ceased to move and they were bleeding. Well, she ceased to move, and he just stepped right over her. If she would have moved, then it would have been a different story. He probably wouldn't have known what to do, because, you know, the taking of life.
You mean because she didn't fulfill what he was used to happening on the video game?
Well, she did fulfill what you
But
was used to.
I see, if she hadn't have.
And I mean, I think some of these extreme cases, like for example, the Columbine incident or those other things, have been used as examples to try and decry a point that playing violent video games will lead to violent behavior. Most of the research out there that has been conducted on this has actually suggested that it's not the case necessarily, that violent video games doesn't necessarily lead to violent behavior. Now, that's not to say that those people who have engaged in these acts weren't in some way influenced by the negative influences of the video games, and that it has desensitized people, because I think it has. You know, whether you're watching a movie or television or playing a video game, I think we are in many ways desensitized to the violence, to the other inappropriate content that's out there. But
Well, there's a lot of questions now being raised about the mirror neurons, in that the possibility that as I watch something, I am as affected as if it were happening to me. I mean, some study on mirror neurons is suggesting that that might be the case, which is a frightening thing, that it might be arousing the same stress hormones that would be aroused if the event were actually happening. And that's hard on children.
And what about the studies that show that, you know, repeated exposure to an item, video game or others, causes a rewiring of your brain?
Clearly, yeah. Yeah. For me, I do draw the line on, kind of definite line on, to the degree that I have control over my kids, which the days are being numbered, apparently, as they grow older. But human-to-human violence, that's a very clear no. And to the degree that human to fantasy figure or the violence that is done in, they do play sometimes games where they're trying to get rid of each other by bumping or pushing or things of that nature, where that doesn't seem so graphically violent, or it may be considered violent, but not in a way that is quite realistic. So violence is something that's very clearly I object to, but it does get tricky when you look at a game. There are certain elements that might trouble you, but on the whole, it's a pretty innocuous thing, and there's different degrees. So I think using these rating guides, and also if you're going to allow your children, if you're going to play this yourself, I think it's very important to look at the reviews and take a look, go to a shop and how it's actually being played, and really being judicious in the purchase. You cannot simply go by the one-letter rating that's been given.
And to make it time limited, I've been really appreciative of what my sister has done with her kids. And that is that she has limited the amount of time even for learning types of video games. And so the children are used to, when they want to learn about nature, they're out catching frogs in the lake, rather than spending their time watching the frogs on the video game. So I've really appreciated that limiting of just even the time for video games.
Sounds like you're going to have a very short list if you limit the violence, because even under the ratings criteria, it's just a different degree of violence all the way through mature. What do you do as a parent?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, sometimes some sports games I think are considered violent because of the way they're moving, and that's open to interpretation.
Of course, some would say this is violent. You know what I'm saying? Many stories here are.
Yeah. So I think, and I don't want to be misunderstood, but there's degrees of violence that are acceptable for me. For example, in the sports setting, or in a way that is controlled and is not necessarily seeking to harm.
Yeah, the object of the game is to.
Yeah, but then I would agree with you. The time element is, for me, also
to me,
very.
That's one of the largest.
Because also, as you said earlier, it makes you involved in your own life, and you're kind of living in your own self-enclosed world, which also has big social implications.
Yeah, and her kids have learned that when she says it's time to put it away, they need to drop it. Because it's hard to change attention from it to something else, and she's trying to teach them how to change attention from that to other things, and it's tough. It's really tough.
Well, I think we can all take away that there is discretion that should be used in what video games we select, and also the amount of time that's spent playing them. And I think that there's ample resources out there. Just Google it, and you'll find plenty of information that can help you make the appropriate decision.
So video games, is it a playground of good and evil? Probably both. Thank you for joining our discussion. This has been Intersections, where faith, ideas, and life meet.